Howdy and welcome, boys, to Mr. East's Classroom. In today's video, we're going to be covering some of the factors that really set the stage for the events that will lead to the American Revolution. So the other day when we were talking about the colonies in the middle of the 18th century, we observed that generally speaking, the colonists were very happy to be part of the British Empire. Things were going well, the colonies themselves were prosperous, and generally there was a good feeling between the British government and the American colonists. That was because the colonists existed in a state of benign neglect, for one, but they also associated membership in the British Empire as bringing them benefits and prestige. But obviously, if we're going to get to 1776, when the colonists are willing to go to war to fight for their independence against the British Empire, a couple of things really have to change in order to make that scenario make any sense to us. To understand this massive change in American public opinion, or colonial public opinion, we're going to have to start with the end of the French and Indian War. So first, before the French and Indian War was fought, Americans saw the British Empire as being a necessary force to provide for their common defense. The fear of foreign attack was always present, as was the attack by Native Americans egged on by foreign forces. Second, the British Empire and the British government really demanded very little from the colonists on a regular basis. They would require some colonial militias whenever they fought in a conflict, but otherwise they didn't tax them very much at all, and they didn't really enforce trade policy much at all either. So from the American perspective, they were promised good military defense without really any cost. All of this is going to change at the war's end with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The Treaty of Paris saw Britain take over pretty much all of the French land east of the Mississippi River, as can be seen in this map. All of the pink territory is the land that was gained by Britain following the war with the French. Now, as we can also see, a bunch of land, pretty much all of the land west of the Mississippi River, including the land on which New Orleans sits, was given to the Spanish. That was actually done in a secret treaty by the French the year before the end of the war, the idea being give some of the land over to Spain as opposed to Britain getting all of it, because France could see the writing on the wall. They understood that they weren't going to be able to hold on to their colonial possessions for the time being. With the French gone and all this new land opened up, we have a very new and different balance of power. No longer is there a foreign threat on the colonists' border that makes participation in the sort of British common defense system make much sense. They no longer see a very pressing need for a British military presence. On the other hand, what they do see is all this land ripe for the taking, and all they want is the power to go out there and get it. Yes, there are many Native Americans on the land, which we're about to discuss, but there's no longer any European power backing those Native Americans up. But let's look at things from the British perspective, because they're the ones who are going to take the action that will create the situation that we see unfolding 15 years later. So at the end of the 7 Years' War, at the end of the French and Indian War, which is a part of the 7 Years' War, as we mentioned in class, it was a global war going across the globe from India to Europe to the Americas. Britain has a huge amount of national debt. In order to pay for the war, they more or less doubled their national debt. And the haphazard way that they went into the war revealed many inefficiencies in their overseas empire. How things were organized, the chain of command, all these things. The events of the war forced a lot of questions to be asked, and it caused the British to review how they had done things over the past 100 years. Something else I should mention, and that we touched on briefly in a previous video, since the 1680s and the Glorious Revolution, in Britain the people who really make policy and dictate the pace of government is Parliament. The king is there and he has some power, but really he's a titular figure. Britain exists in a state of what's called parliamentary superiority, where the main decisions of government and the main authority in government rests in Parliament. So when we talk about Britain seeing the need for change and Britain passing laws and acts to make changes in the empire, we're mostly talking about Parliament making these decisions, and often they will use the voice and authority of the king. The king's main interest in all of this is sort of promoting imperial prestige. He sees himself as the owner of the empire, and so he takes pride in these things, but the king won't get involved in most of the nitty-gritty decision-making. So in 1763, Parliament is going to see the need to reform the empire along three basic lines, or keeping three basic needs in mind. One, it has a very large debt from the war that it needs to start paying down. Two, it's discovered many inefficiencies in the way that the empire is administered, and it wants to start addressing those for greater efficiency. And three, it feels the need to maintain a large army overseas. Part of this is the necessity of maintaining order in a large overseas empire, but a very large part of it is the desire not to reduce the size of the army now that the war is over. That's because many officers and soldiers in the army are very well connected to members of Parliament, and they see a financial interest in keeping their jobs. The first guy who's going to lead these efforts at reform is a man named George Grenville, and he is the Prime Minister, so basically the leader of Parliament and the leader of government in Britain, starting in 1763. And he's going to lead efforts at reform that tackle three specific issues, which keep those concerns we just discussed in mind. The first is trade, right? Remember, the reason to have colonial overseas possession from the perspective of the mother country is to promote trade and commerce. So they're going to have several reforms that address the way trade is conducted between the colonies and the mother country. Second, they're going to see the need to promote security across the empire and to maintain British authority overseas. Three, they're going to look for ways to raise revenue, and this is really what most of the other reforms are involved with as well, is raising money through taxation, which will of course be the most famous of the causes for the American Revolution. So one of the first issues that Britain addresses right from the get-go is that they have all of this new land under their control. Basically, North America is just split right down the middle between Britain and Spain now. Now, one of Britain's first concerns after getting out of a world war is to ensure that it does not immediately get back into other costly wars. So what they decide to do is issue what's known as the Proclamation Line of 1763, which is this line here. So the land that can be accessed by the colonists and settled is colored in a darker red. And the line that basically runs the length of the Appalachian Mountains is the Proclamation Line. And on the outside of that is a pink territory, which is split up into different sort of departments. The reason for this line is to keep the peace. Britain knows that there's many Native American tribes on the outside of that line, and what they don't want to happen is many colonial wars breaking out where the colonists get into some fights with large Indian confederacies. One event that prompts this worry is Pontiac's Rebellion over in sort of the Midwest area, where many Native Americans band together to try and revolt against British authority. It's important to note that at this time there is still a relatively large amount of Native Americans living in the near west, the land just over the Appalachian Mountains and east of the Mississippi River. And what's more, they're fairly well organized. Okay, obviously not as well organized as a European state at this time, but there's several Indian confederacies that will band together to try and resist American colonization and expansion. Now, the American colonists are really enraged and angered by this proclamation. As we remember, one of the causes for the French and Indian War in the first place was colonists trying to get out into French-claimed area, explore it, survey it, and take it as new land. That's one of the reasons George Washington, a land surveyor, was out there in the first place. Also, there's already colonists living in places like Kentucky at this time, and they feel abandoned by the British government. The reason the colonists were gung-ho about fighting the war was the expectation that they'd have all sorts of land that they could now expand into. If you look at colonial land claims at this time, at one point Virginia basically claims all of the land westward and towards the Pacific Ocean. These are outlandish land claims, but the idea is that they see all of this land that is there for the taking, and they feel that the British Empire won't let them expand to take it. They also feel talked down to. Remember, as I said in class, Americans are very proud people at this time. They feel that they are sort of important people. They have a strong understanding of their rights and their rights as Englishmen, and they feel that they should be consulted on these issues and not talked down to by parliamentary government. The second factor, or the second set of practical actions that Britain takes, is to maintain a large standing army in North America. Large by the standards of the day, at any rate. So we're talking about 10 to 15,000 soldiers. These soldiers are going to be stationed in forts out in the west, in that land that's basically reserved for the Indians. But they're also going to be stationed in some of the colonies themselves. The British have two central reasons that really is hard to distinguish between which was more important or less important for maintaining this army. One, a very simple reason, is that they want to keep officers employed. British military officers are usually members of the social elite and they're well connected. Now that the war's over, they don't want to lose their jobs. So the British government needs to find something for them to do nominally. And they can't station them in Britain because the British public has sort of a natural antipathy against standing armies. It's a traditional part of their character. The downside for the British is the American colonists feel the same way. They don't want a large standing army walking around. They feel then, as many Americans do today, that it's a threat to their freedom. The second reason for having an army in the colonies is to maintain order, and this is a real concern. After Pontiac's rebellion in 1763, the British are concerned that you might have other larger Native American uprisings against their colonial expansion. At the same time, you have sort of up-and-coming American settlers trying to get out there over the Appalachians and expand, and that can lead to conflicts between the Indians and the Americans, and the British want to ensure that none of this gets out of hand. So that's another reason for having an army overseas. But really, the Army's presence is going to enrage the Americans, or the colonists, for two reasons. One, they don't like having a standing army around them. They feel threatened by it. It kind of feels like they're not being trusted to do their own thing. And second, they look at the Army and the soldiers and they see them basically sitting around and doing nothing. And they're going to feel like their money is going to pay for this army that is basically useless. Additionally, sometimes soldiers in town will steal work from local colonists, and sometimes they'll be accused of getting drunk and rowdy and those sorts of things. As I mentioned, the British, or the Parliament, is going to try and tighten controls on colonial trade policy. As we know, for about a century now, the colonists have existed under a sort of an order of salutary neglect, where the British Empire nominally has rules they need to follow but doesn't really enforce them. That's gone. Now that they've just fought a large war over colonial possessions, the British are taking their colonies a lot more seriously, and they want them to run in a profitable and efficient way. That means that the old, almost 100-year-old Navigation Acts, they're going to start to be enforced now. That means that colonists are going to be expected to trade with Britain first, sometimes at the exclusion of all other foreign nations. They're going to have to buy British goods more directly, which will raise prices on their goods. And often for shipping purposes, Americans will have to ship and buy goods shipped on British vessels. All of this is designed to promote British industry, and they see it as the natural course of empire. But if you're a colonist used to basically getting away with not following all these rules, it's really going to irk you. Additionally, they'll pass acts like the Sugar Act, which was actually a lowering of the tax rate that had been on the books. The thing was, there used to be a tariff, a tax on sugar imports that was so high that no one paid it and everyone smuggled around it. With the Sugar Act of 1764, I believe, around that time, maybe 65, they lower the tax rate but actually start enforcing it, which to the colonists feels like a brand new tax, and that's going to frustrate commerce. All of this is geared at making more money and sending more trade directly toward Britain. But finally, we have the major issue of just plain straight taxation. We all know that this is going to be a factor leading to the revolution. No representation without taxation. But why is it such a big issue? Well, first of all, Parliament is looking to the colonies for more revenue. Part of that will get sorted out with the trade policies. But in addition to those, they're going to start passing direct taxes and controls on the colonies to try and get more money from them and make them more obedient subjects, more properly colonies and not just some loosely affiliated set of settlers across the ocean. This is a big deal for a couple of reasons. First of all, the colonists had never been directly taxed by the British. They'd had tariffs and all those sorts of things before, but never before had tax revenue been directly raised from individual Americans. So we'll have the Sugar Act, which was a kind of tariff, but we'll also have a sort of famous one, the Stamp Act, which was a tax that they had in place in Britain but not in the colonies. And that would be basically you had to get a royal seal on most legal documents, which would cost money, and that would be a way of raising revenue for the British. This was very agitating in an age where, in the colonies, where paper was used for pretty much all transactions. This was a tax that they would actually see and encounter on a regular basis, and which would have been more successful at raising money if the colonists hadn't gotten so angry over it. Later into the 1760s, we're going to have what are called the Townshend Acts, which were a series of acts sort of gotten together by a man named Charles Townshend. He was the financial minister for Britain, a position that was called the Chancellor of the Exchequer. You don't have to know all of the acts involved in the Townshend Acts, but know that it was multiple revenue acts trying to find creative new ways at either controlling colonial trade or enforcing British tax collection in the colonies. The colonies are going to go berserk over these acts. They'll see Britain is continuing to ignore their protests and carry on. We'll talk about some of the nitty-gritty of that in class, but you get the general idea. Britain Parliament is looking for new, often creative ways at raising taxes in the colonies, and the colonies are going to get very angry over these for a few reasons. Those reasons for colonial anger over the taxes can be broken into two basic categories. One is economic, and the second is legal principle. So on the economic front, it's the same reason pretty much everyone hates taxes across time and in all parts of the world, and that's because it costs money. And the colonists had been used to not paying taxes straight to Britain for 100 years, and now they were being asked to do so. Compared to the British tax burden at home in England, the taxes being raised were not particularly high, but it was something that the Americans weren't used to. And they also didn't necessarily think that there was any good reason for it. They saw a bunch of British soldiers lazing around. They didn't think those were necessary. They also felt stifled because they didn't see any direct benefit from the French and Indian War because they weren't allowed to settle the new land. And having fought the war, whether accurately or not, Americans got the feeling that they were capable of standing on their own 2 feet without direct British help. The second set of reasons that are going to be really important as time goes on into crystallizing a sort of American independent consciousness is the legal principle aspect. As I've said in class, and as I've said briefly in this video, Americans, at the time colonists, did not think of themselves as a separate people, but as Englishmen. And Englishmen were expected to have a number of rights. One of those rights was that the people, the English people, had to be consulted before they were taxed. Their assent nominally had to be given on new forms of taxation. Traditionally, that consent was taken through Parliament. So if Parliament agreed on a new tax in England, that was okay because British people were at least nominally represented in Parliament. Americans had no representation in Parliament, and so they felt that for any new taxation, their legislatures and assemblies had to be asked first. That or they had to be granted representation in Parliament. If they were taxed without this consent or without representation, it felt that their ancestral inherited rights were being violated and that effectively they were being treated as children. Often they would draw comparisons to slavery. Remember, Americans have slaves. They're very familiar with what slavery looks like, and they're saying that if you're taxing us without our consent, you're treating us like slaves, not as British subjects. It's a very powerful metaphor that, of course, will bring all kinds of controversy, especially when looked at today, and is a very serious charge. A fact about Americans really throughout time is that they don't like being told what to do, and they follow matters of principle very, very closely. So there's a phrase at the time that Americans are good at spotting tyranny far off before it actually occurs to them. So they're following the logical implications of the new taxation more than the actual burden is hitting them. So the tax burden's annoying, but it's not overwhelming. But they're saying that in principle they could take this as far as, taxing us out of our ears, and ultimately that's not right because we have these English rights that should be respected. In fact, this period is marked by very serious public debate over the issue. People are really arguing about the legal principles of it all. And the collected or the combined effect of everything we've talked about is that moving through the 1860s and towards the end of them, toward the 1870s, there is a new kind of relationship and a new tension between the colonies. Instead of feeling as very happy members of the empire, colonies are starting to get some grievances built up. And they're not looking for independence yet, but they are looking for reform. And that'll set the stage moving into the 1770s where we want to go. One final note, which is kind of funny, the French actually saw an advantage to trading away the rest of their land in North America to Spain, not because they didn't want colonies in the New World, but because they actually thought that if they removed their presence from the border, the Americans might eventually turn against the British government itself instead of being afraid of the French. As we see, they may have been proven correct on that score. They were just incorrect about their prospects of retaking their land in North America.